Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Thursday, the 22nd of January. I'm Stephen Carroll in London. Coming up today, a Greenland reversal. US President Donald Trump backs away from his tariff threats against Europe as he touts a framework deal on the Arctic territory. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says he's ready to commit frozen Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine. Plus, knocked off the top of the table while the Premier League is losing ground in football's money rankings. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. The US President Donald Trump says he won't impose tariffs on goods from European countries opposed to his efforts to acquire Greenland. In a social media post, Trump cited the framework of a future deal reached with NATO as the reason for the change. It followed a meeting with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Speaking to reporters in the conference centre shortly afterwards, the US President offered further insight into the deal.
It's a deal that people jumped at. Really fantastic for the USA. Gets everything we wanted, including especially real national security and international security.
How so? Can you give us some details, please?
Well, the deal is going to be put out pretty soon. I mean, we'll see. It's right now a little bit in progress, but pretty far along. It gets us everything we needed to get.
Does it still include the United States having ownership of Greenland like you said you wanted?
It's a long-term deal. It's the ultimate long-term deal. I think it puts everybody in a really good position, especially as it pertains to security and minerals under the minerals. What happens is people are out there and they're working it right now. They're working the details of the deal, but it's what's called an infinite deal.
Despite Trump's optimism, the US president did not give any details on what the agreement entails. The New York Times reports that the discussions included a compromise in which Denmark would give the US sovereignty over small pockets of land on Greenland for the construction of military bases. The apparent breakthrough came after Denmark had ruled out negotiations over ceding the semi-autonomous island to the US. Speaking to Fox News, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte said the talks focused on how to implement Trump's vision while also protecting Greenland. He was asked whether Greenland is still under the control of Denmark under this framework deal.
That issue did not come up anymore in my conversations tonight with the President. He's very much focused on what do we need to do to make sure that that huge Arctic region, where change is taking place at the moment, where the Chinese and Russians are more and more active, how we can protect that. That was really the focus of our discussions.
NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte speaking on Fox News after the Danish Foreign Minister welcomed the latest developments. In an interview with national broadcaster DR, Lars Løkke Rasmussen said the day ends better than it started. However, he added that it's obvious that Trump had not given up on his ambition to gain control of Greenland, which remains a red line for the Kingdom of Denmark. Well, global stocks are rallying after President Trump abandoned those tariff threats. Asian shares are rising. Momentum looks set to carry into the European session too. Markets going risk on and safe havens such as gold dropping. Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent Mike McKee says the pivot has driven markets.
The markets went way down, and today they started to go back up again because everybody started to think, no, he can't do this. And he's probably going to chicken out the taco trade. And so people started, buying risk assets again, and then the headline crosses that he's back down, and so everybody just piles back in again.
Mike McKee speaking there as the president's policy shift appeared to vindicate investors who adhere to the taco trade, that is buying any dip caused by US tariff threats, because they argue Trump always chickens out when there's a major market sell-off. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has said he's ready to commit frozen Russian assets in the United States towards rebuilding damaged regions of Ukraine once a deal to end the war has been concluded. Putin told Russia's Security Council that he could also give $1 billion of the assets for membership of President Trump's Board of Peace for post-war Gaza. Speaking in Davos, US envoy Steve Witkoff gave an update on plans for the Peace Board, which is still in its early stages.
We've got 20 or maybe 25 leaders who have already said yes. This is not such an easy place to get to. We had many people who we weren't sure if they were going to even want to get an invitation. Now they're calling up for invitations. So everyone wants to be a part of this. What we're going to do here, what the president is going to do here, will be it'll be game-changing for the world.
Witkoff was speaking ahead of a meeting with Putin in Moscow later today. The joint Russian offer is designed to appeal to President Trump and avoid further economic sanctions using money frozen under the Biden administration, which the Kremlin does not control. UK business leaders want to keep under pressure Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, but are open to backing Nigel Farage's Reform UK at the next election. The survey of 500 executives shared exclusively with Bloomberg showed nearly half saw Starmer leaving Downing Street as a serious threat to their business. Bloomberg's James Woolcock has more.
Businesses crave political stability, so it's not necessarily a surprise they are worried about the Labour Party toppling its unpopular leader. But that does make it all the more interesting that when asked to vote on behalf of their companies at the next general election, executives were split between backing Labour and the untested Reform UK party. The other nugget in the Bradshaw advisory poll, business leaders reflect the rest of Britain's fractured politics. Instead of the old two-party system, 5 parties managed to secure at least 10% of the executives' backing. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
And those are your top stories on the markets. The Eurostoxx 50 futures up by 1%. The MSCI Irish Pacific Index 0.7 higher. The Kospi and Seoul hitting a new record up by 0.7% as well. Gold is lower by 0.2%, but not far off those record highs it hit yesterday. Japanese government bonds are rallying too for a second day in a row. The 30-year JGB down 5 basis points this morning. In a moment, we'll bring you more on the US president pulling back on his tariff threats, plus why English football clubs are falling down a money-making ranking. But another story that we've been reading this morning. So you may or may not trust AI to write emails for you, but do you use it to make your communication more appropriate at work? Issa Lipowski has been writing about this for Bloomberg Business Week with examples from workers who use ChatGPT to tone down pointed emails, especially when you write exactly what you really think and then get AI to tone it down. It can also be used to help smooth over cultural differences in communication styles. Nick Studer, the CEO of Oliver Wyman, says that he has a slightly English reserve when it comes to how he communicates. So he uses their internal chatbot to review emails and make them more effective for their audiences, if you can read between the lines of that. Another point that he makes is that AI can serve as a sounding board for sensitive conversations that senior leaders often can't share with those around them. And there's also the question of AI being able to help with some of the cognitive load that many managers can feel. Another executive that Izzy spoke to for this article described how she tends to be too direct in communications and actually was able to use ChatGPT to prepare for a difficult performance review with an employee. So rather than writing it, waiting a day and then coming back to it and trying to revise it, which is the process she would have used before. Now, in all of these examples, I did note that these executives did also talk about there being a human review. They would look over it. They would still discuss it with colleagues as well. I find that quite heartening because there is a worry, and it's something that Izzy highlights in the piece as well, that there's an argument to be made this it could actually lead to a removal of compassion or the human element to some of this communication that makes it effective. But a lot of professionals are seeing AI and these large language models as a way to engage with people more tactfully and gracefully that they might either have the time or the ability to do on their own. Really interesting piece with some great interviews. We'll put a link to it in our podcast show notes. Well, let's bring you the latest now on Donald Trump pulling back on those tariff threats over Greenland. Our White House reporter Skylar Woodhouse joins us for more. Skylar, good to talk to you. Donald Trump says that he changed his mind over this framework of a future deal over Greenland reached after talks with NATO's Mark Rutte. What do we know about this deal?
Well, President Trump last night in an interview with CNBC after his meeting with the NATO Secretary General said he had, quote, concepts of a plan, which is a term we've heard from President Trump before. So I do think a lot of those details are being hashed out. But what we do know is that the president has sort of walked back his, aggressive, I guess, stance on, from the tariffs to he in his speech yesterday at Davos took using military force off the table. So it does seem like he is dialing down his tone. But I mean, the president said, like I said, concepts of a plan. So I think only President Trump really knows what he wants to do right now. And that's something we're all trying to figure out as we try and get inside the president's mind, as we try and understand what the next steps are. But I do think this is something that is still going to be a priority for President Trump. He just definitely walked back his tone as he tried to, as Secretary Bessent said earlier this week, he told everyone to calm down and take a deep breath. And that's sort of what President Trump did yesterday. He sort of eased fears on what he was planning to do.
Are we clear? And I understand getting inside the president's head is both difficult and something that you do on a daily basis. But are we clear whether or not Donald Trump has given up on his ambition of owning Greenland?
I do not think the president has given up on his, hopes to take over Greenland. I think one thing that was interesting from his speech yesterday was pretty much leading up to Davos, the White House, the administration had been touting that this was going to be a speech about affordability and housing costs in the U.S. And the president totally took a different pivot, and in the speech even joked about how he wasn't going to bring up Greenland, and then pretty much focused solely on Greenland and NATO in his speech yesterday. So I think that just shows how much of a priority this is for the president. Just like what we saw with Venezuela, that was something that the administration had been hinting at for quite a bit. And I think with Greenland, it's going to be the same picture. I think, look, President Trump, he might make some aggressive claims, and what history has shown so far is in some shape or form, he does tend to get his way, you could say. But I think, he definitely has scaled back his tone on, he said he's not going to use military force, but I do think he is going to continue to push these discussions on how the U.S. can find a way to take over Greenland, if not take over parts of Greenland.
Skylar, this whole affair has been hugely damaging to what was already a fragile relationship between the US and its European allies. We've seen the European Parliament, for example, suspend implementation of the trade deal. Does any of that matter to the Trump administration?
I think the Trump administration, I do think they value their relationships with allies. I think one thing they have done since returning back to the White House last year is disrupted sort of global affairs, especially with what we saw, essentially on Liberation Day with President Trump rolling out his various tariff policies. So I do think they value their relationships, but it really comes as no surprise. I mean, look, the president is known for truthing that he is going to do something and then taking a step back, which is really what we saw with these with the tariffs he was threatening to slap on the EU and the UK. So I mean, for anyone who's trying to maintain a relationship, that's maybe not the best way to go about it. But I mean, that's the president's style, and it's sort of just how do leaders around the world adapt to that. But I would imagine that the president wants to keep those relationships because he does, I think, understand that at the end of the day, he has to have those relationships. And I think there's people in his orbit who recognize that. But, this is really the president sort of leading with that. Even though there's been arguments that how America First is this is him basically trying to, assert his dominance that the U.S. is, the superpower. But within that, he's going to understand that he does need to maintain those relationships.
Okay, Skylar, thanks so much for joining us. Our White House reporter, Skylar Woodhouse there. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this. Now, for the first time in 29 years, there's no English football team in the top of Deloitte's Money League, which tracks revenue generated by clubs across Europe. The top four are Real Madrid, FC Barcelona, Bayern Munich and Paris Saint-Germain, with Liverpool in fifth place. Our reporter Tiwa Adebayo is here with the details. Tiwa, why is this a significant milestone for English football?
Well, I think it's really significant in what it says really about the propulsive power of the Premier League. So despite winning the Premier League, Liverpool, as you mentioned, only fifth in these money rankings. And that's even though the Premier League is considered by many to be the most competitive league in the world. It's also the most watched around the world. So this is really a milestone in terms of showing that perhaps the quality of football doesn't match the quality of earnings here. But I also think it's a milestone in terms of the internal earnings rankings for the English clubs. It's the first time we've seen Liverpool be the top of that group in these rankings. Previously, we've seen the dominance of mega clubs like Manchester United. Sorry to any Man United fans. They lost out on a lot of broadcast revenue last year due to poor performance in the Premier League, and it seems that's only continued. They didn't qualify for the top flight of European football, and a similar thing happened to their direct rivals Manchester City as well. So it could be a changing of the guard in that sense, but it really seems overall that the Premier League is no longer the ticket to financial success that it once was for these clubs.
So what's driven the revenue of those clubs that did emerge on top? I mentioned the 4 names there.
Well, it's interesting because I think this shift really speaks to perhaps the quality of Premier League football. In some ways, you could say that the Premier League is a victim of its own success, and that it's so competitive now that the eras of 1 or 2 clubs dominating has really passed. And in comparison, in Europe, that's exactly what's been driving revenue. The most lucrative clubs are names like Real Madrid or Bayern Munich, Paris Saint-Germain. They almost always win domestic trophies and also qualify for the Champions League. So that's a much safer bet for investors. And that is really something we've seen being picked up, especially in parts of the women's game that are looking to kind of build steady revenue streams. The very popular NWSL, that's the US Women's League, is a closed league, so there's no promotion or relegation. And really the argument there is that attracts much bigger sponsorship and investment because it's a safe bet that team will continue to be in top flight football.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.